The gavel came down like thunder, but it was Judge Harrison's fist that shattered everything until Commander Riley Washington reminded him that some people don't break. Welcome back to our amazing family of story lovers. If this story grabs you like I know it will, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because tomorrow I'm bringing you another incredible story you absolutely cannot miss. Now, let's dive into today's story. This is about a decorated Navy SEAL who walked into a courtroom expecting justice, but instead faced a racist judge who made the biggest mistake of his career. Let's begin. Commander Riley Washington adjusted the ribbon rack on her dress. Blue uniform one final time, her fingers lingering over the Bronze Star with V device. 22 years of service, 3 deployments, countless lives saved, and still, she felt the familiar knot in her stomach as she approached the courthouse steps. The morning sun caught the gold stripes on her sleeves, but Riley knew that in Judge Harrison's courtroom, her decorations meant less than the color of her skin. She'd researched him thoroughly. Harold Harrison, 63, appointed during a different era when diversity was a whispered word rather than a mandate. His record spoke volumes: harsh sentences for minorities, lenient treatment for white defendants, and a reputation that made defense attorneys cringe when they drew his courtroom. "Ma'am?" A young Marine corporal approached hesitantly. "Corporal Martinez, I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing." Riley's case wasn't just about her anymore. 3 months ago, she'd been arrested during a peaceful protest outside the naval base, a demonstration against the wrongful discharge of gay and lesbian service members. The charges were trumped up: disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. All lies, but lies had a way of sticking when told by the right people to the right ears. "Just doing what's right, Corporal." "Still, ma'am, takes courage." Courage. Riley almost laughed. She'd fast-roped into terrorist compounds, defused bombs with seconds to spare, carried wounded soldiers through gunfire. But walking into Judge Harrison's courtroom felt more terrifying than any battlefield. Inside, the courthouse hummed with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Riley's attorney, David Chen, waited by the metal detectors, his usually confident demeanor strained. "Riley, I need to prepare you," he said quietly. "I've been hearing things. Harrison's been vocal about this case. About you." "What kind of vocal?" David's jaw tightened. "The kind that makes me wish we could request a different judge." They moved through security, Riley's boots echoing against marble floors that had witnessed decades of justice and its absence. She noticed the stares, court clerks pausing their conversations, bailiffs adjusting their positions, spectators craning their necks. Some faces showed curiosity, others support. A few revealed the naked hostility she'd grown accustomed to. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Judge Harold Harrison straightened his black robes and admired himself in the mirror of his chambers. At 63, he still cut an imposing figure, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a kind of commanding presence that made attorneys stammer and defendants cower. "Another bleeding-heart liberal case," he muttered to his clerk, Janet. Navy SEAL or not, she stepped out of line. Time someone reminded these people about respect for authority. Janet, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, shifted uncomfortably. "Judge, perhaps nothing." Harrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I've been on this bench for 18 years, Janet. I know how to handle troublemakers." He'd read Riley's file, of course. Decorated war hero, spotless record, commendations that would make most service members weep with envy. It didn't matter. In his courtroom, she was just another defendant who'd forgotten her place. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own son, Bradley, had washed out of basic training after 3 weeks, claiming anxiety and stress. No Bronze Stars for Bradley. No acts of heroism under fire. Just a trust fund and a job at Daddy's law firm, courtesy of connections, rather than merit. Harrison adjusted his tie, a gift from Bradley last Christmas. Expensive silk that probably cost more than most people made in a week. He'd wear it today as a reminder of what real success looked like. Back in the courtroom, Riley took her seat at the defendant's table, spine straight, hands folded. The gallery filled slowly. Fellow veterans showing support, civil rights activists with notepads, reporters sensing a story. She spotted her sister Carmen in the third row, tears already threatening to spill. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harold Harrison. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Riley stood with military precision, watching as Harrison emerged from his chambers, like a king surveying his domain. His eyes found her immediately, and she saw something flicker across his face: disgust, contempt. Whatever it was, it made her skin crawl. "Be seated." Harrison's gavel cracked against wood. "We're here today for the matter of People versus Washington. Before we begin, I want to make something crystal clear." His gaze locked on Riley. "I don't care how many ribbons you wear or how many missions you've completed. In my courtroom, you're just another defendant who needs to learn respect for the law." David Chen shot to his feet. "Your Honor, that's what, Counselor." "The truth?" Harrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Sit down before I find you in contempt." Riley felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she'd experienced in combat zones. Her training kicked in. Assess the threat, identify escape routes, protect the mission. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Iraq. This was supposed to be America, where justice wore a blindfold and scales balanced equally. She was about to learn how heavy those scales could be when prejudice sat behind the bench. What would you do if you found yourself facing obvious bias in a place where you expected fairness? Share your thoughts on how we can stand up for justice even when the system seems stacked against us. The prosecution's opening statement felt like watching a magician perform sleight of hand. Truth twisted into lies so smoothly that Riley almost admired the artistry. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Vance painted her as a violent agitator who'd attacked peaceful officers, conveniently omitting the body camera footage that contradicted every word. "Commander Washington may wear the uniform of our nation," Vance declared, her voice dripping with false patriotism, but her actions that day showed complete disrespect for law and order. A true patriot doesn't resist arrest. A true hero doesn't assault police officers. Riley's jaw tightened. She'd watched 3 junior sailors get dragged away in zip ties for holding signs. She'd seen Officer Brennan deliberately shove an elderly veteran to the ground. When she'd stepped forward to help the man up, Brennan had grabbed her wrist and twisted. Her defensive response, a textbook disarming technique that left Brennan unharmed but embarrassed, had somehow become assault. David Chen's opening painted a different picture entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you'll see on the defense's evidence is clear. Commander Washington acted with restraint that would make any training officer proud. When faced with excessive force, she protected herself and others with the minimum force necessary. This isn't a case about law and order, it's about whether we'll allow our heroes to be persecuted for doing what's right." Judge Harrison's expression grew darker with each word. Riley watched his hands grip the bench, knuckles white against the dark wood. When David mentioned the phrase excessive force, Harrison's face flushed red. "Counselor," Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. "I'll remind you that this court holds our police officers in the highest regard. I won't tolerate inflammatory language designed to prejudice this jury." "Your Honor, you were simply overstepping. Continue with facts, not opinions." The first witness took the stand, Officer Michael Brennan himself, 34 years old, with soft hands and a softer gut that spoke of too many desk assignments. Under oath he spun a tale that would have made Hollywood proud. A peaceful arrest, disrupted by an aggressive defendant who'd attacked without provocation. "She came at me like a wild animal," Brennan testified, his voice quavering with practiced emotion. "I feared for my safety. These military types, they're trained killers. You never know when they might snap." Riley felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd heard those words before, whispered in VA waiting rooms, muttered by employers, who found excuses not to hire veterans. Repeated by politicians who loved the flag but forgot the people who'd bled for it. David's cross-examination was surgical. "Officer Brennan, you testified that Commander Washington came at you like a wild animal. But isn't it true that she was helping an elderly veteran who'd fallen?" "That's not. She was interfering with police operations." "Operations? You mean when you pushed 73-year-old Harold Martinez to the ground? He was resisting." "Mr. Martinez is a Purple Heart recipient with 2 artificial knees, Officer Brennan. How exactly was he resisting?" Judge Harrison leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Counselor, you're badgering the witness. Move on." But the damage was done. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably, and Riley caught one woman, a black mother in her 40s, shaking her head in disgust. The body camera footage should have ended it. Should have. But as they prepared to play it, Harrison suddenly called for a recess. 10 minutes, he announced, then fixed Riley with a stare that made her skin crawl. "Miss Washington, approach the bench." Riley stood, every instinct screaming danger. David moved to follow, but Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Alone. Counselor, sit down." The courtroom fell silent as Riley walked to the bench, her footsteps echoing like gunshots. Harrison leaned forward, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You think you're special, don't you?" His breath smelled of coffee and something darker, hatred fermented over decades. "All those ribbons. All that hero worship. But I see what you really are." Riley kept her voice steady. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor." "Don't play dumb with me, girl." The word hit like a slap. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you. Think you can disrupt my courtroom, turn my trial into some kind of circus." Heat flashed behind Riley's eyes, but her training held. "Your Honor, I've done nothing but sit quietly and listen." "You've done plenty." Harrison's hand moved to his gavel, fingers wrapping around it like a weapon. "Prancing around in that uniform, trying to intimidate my jury with your war stories. Well, let me tell you something." He stood suddenly, towering over her, his face twisted with decades of buried resentment. The gavel rose in his hand, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, Riley saw her father in Harrison's eyes, the same rage, the same desperate need to feel powerful by making someone else feel small. "Your Honor?" David's voice seemed to come from another world. That's when it happened. Harrison's control snapped like an overstretched cable. His hand came down fast and hard, not with the gavel but with his fist, catching Riley across the cheek with enough force to stagger her. The courtroom erupted. Someone screamed. The bailiff jumped to his feet. But all Riley heard was the roar of blood in her ears and a voice from her past. Her drill instructor at Coronado, shouting over the crash of waves. "You don't get to quit, Washington. You don't get to break." Harrison drew back for another blow, his face purple with rage, spittle flying as he screamed, "Learn your place, you uppity." He never finished the sentence. Riley's response was instinctive, born from thousands of hours of training and 3 combat deployments where hesitation meant death. Her left hand caught his wrist, stopping the second blow cold. Her right palm struck his solar plexus, controlled, precise, just enough to drop him gasping to his knees behind the bench. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison wheezed on the floor, his black robes twisted around him like a broken umbrella. Riley stood over him, her hand still extended, breathing steady despite the chaos erupting around her. Blood trickled from her split lip, but her eyes were clear and calm as mountain lakes. "Bailiff!" someone shouted. "Arrest her!" But the bailiff, a graying veteran named Rodriguez, stood frozen, his hand halfway to his weapon. He'd seen the whole thing. They all had. Riley slowly raised her hands, palms open, and stepped back from the bench. When she spoke, her voice carried across the courtroom like a command given under fire. "I defended myself against an unprovoked assault. Nothing more, nothing less." Judge Harrison struggled to his feet, his face cycling through red, purple, and white as reality crashed over him like a cold wave. 100 phones were recording. Reporters scribbled frantically. The jury sat transfixed, watching justice remove her blindfold and reveal the ugly truth beneath. In that moment, everything changed. The hunter had become the hunted, the powerful had revealed their weakness, and a Navy SEAL had reminded a room full of people what real courage looked like. But Riley knew this was just the beginning. In her world, the hardest battles always came after the first shot was fired. When someone in authority abuses their power, what's the right way to respond? Share your thoughts on the balance between defending yourself and respecting institutions, even when those institutions fail us. The next 12 hours felt like drowning in slow motion. Riley sat in a holding cell at the county jail, her dress blues replaced with orange scrubs that hung loose on her frame. The charge was assault on a judicial officer, a felony that could cost her everything: her commission, her pension, her freedom. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd survived 3 deployments without a scratch, only to be wounded in an American courthouse. Her cheek throbbed where Harrison's fist had connected, the bruise blooming purple-black like a storm cloud. But the physical pain was nothing compared to watching the system she'd sworn to defend twist itself into knots to protect one of its own. The first sign came at 2 a.m. when Detective Ray Sullivan arrived for questioning. Riley knew the type immediately: 20-year veteran with dead eyes and a gut that spoke of too many late-night donuts. He slapped a folder on the metal table between them and smiled like a shark. "Hell of a thing you did today, Washington. Attacking a judge in open court." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of photographs showing Harrison on his knees. Riley standing over him with her hand extended. "Looks pretty bad from this angle." "You have the video," Riley said quietly. "You know what really happened." Sullivan's smile widened. "Video can be tricky. Angles, lighting, context. Jury might see a decorated war hero losing her temper and assaulting an elderly man who threw the first punch. Your word against a respected judge's. And between you and me," Sullivan leaned forward, his breath stale with coffee and cigarettes, "Judge Harrison's been on that bench for 18 years, pillar of the community. You're just another veteran with anger management issues." Riley's hands remained flat on the table, but Sullivan caught the slight tightening around her eyes. He pressed harder. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to plead guilty to a reduced charge. Simple assault, maybe some anger management classes. Do your time quietly and maybe you keep your pension. Fight this, and we'll bury you so deep, you'll forget what sunlight looks like." "I want my lawyer." "Your lawyer can't change what happened. But cooperation, that might change what happens next." Meanwhile, across town, Judge Harrison paced his study like a caged animal, ice pack pressed to his ribs where Riley's palm strike had landed. His wife Margaret sat in her usual chair, knitting needles clicking in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. "Stop pacing, Harold. You're making me dizzy." "I can't stop." His voice cracked with something between rage and panic. "Do you understand what happened today? What she did to me?" Margaret's needles paused. "From what I saw on the news, she defended herself after you struck her." "I didn't strike anyone." The lie came automatically, but his hand went unconsciously to his knuckles, still sore from the impact. "She attacked me, assaulted a sitting judge in open court. It's on video, for Christ's sake." "The video shows you hitting her first, Harold." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Harrison stopped pacing, his face cycling through emotions faster than traffic lights. "You don't understand. That woman humiliated me. Made me look weak in front of my own courtroom. You did that yourself." The truth hit him like a physical blow. Margaret had been his wife for 32 years, had watched him climb from prosecutor to judge, had bitten her tongue through countless dinner parties where his opinions grew increasingly bitter. But this was different. This was undeniable. She's a Navy SEAL, Margaret, trained killer. For all I know, she could have what? Killed you with her bare hands? Margaret set down her knitting, her voice steady as bedrock. Harold, if that woman wanted to hurt you, you'd be in the hospital, not standing here making excuses. At the city jail, David Chen worked through the night, his usually pristine suit wrinkled from 18 straight hours of crisis management. The district attorney's office was circling like vultures, media requests flooded his phone, and Riley's case had exploded across social media with hashtags like "Justice for Riley" and "Judge Harrison must go." But beneath the public outcry, darker forces were mobilizing. This is about more than one case. District Attorney Patricia Vance explained to her staff in an emergency meeting. Judge Harrison is connected to half the power structure in this city. His brother-in-law runs the largest law firm. His golf buddy controls 3 city council seats. If we don't handle this carefully, it becomes about all of us. The video is pretty damning, offered Adia Marcus Wright, the youngest member of the team. Vance's smile was cold as winter rain. Videos can be interpreted many ways, Marcus. The question isn't what happened, it's what we can prove happened, and what the community is willing to accept. The strategy became clear over the next few hours. Paint Riley as an unstable veteran who'd snapped under pressure, emphasize her military training as a weapon rather than service, find experts to testify about PTSD and combat stress, make the jury afraid of her rather than sympathetic to her. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison sat in his chambers at 3 a.m., staring at his law degree hanging crooked on the wall. His reflection in the dark window showed a man he barely recognized, disheveled, desperate, reduced to calling in favors like a common criminal. "Tom, it's Harold Harrison. I know it's late, but I need a favor." City Councilman Tom Bradley had been expecting the call. "Harold, Jesus Christ, what were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking." "Okay, but we can fix this. We have to fix this." "Fix this?" "Harold, you punched a decorated war hero on live television. The video's been viewed 2 million times. How exactly do we fix that?" Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "The same way we fixed the Patterson case, the same way we handled the Martinez situation. We make it go away." A long pause. Then, "This isn't some DUI or zoning violation, Harold. This is assault on video. The FBI might get involved." "The FBI won't get involved if we handle it right. Play the veteran angle. PTSD, combat stress, dangerous training. Make them afraid of what she might do next time. And if that doesn't work?" Harrison stared at his reflection, seeing his father's face staring back. The same weak chin, the same desperate eyes that had watched their family's money disappear in bad investments and worse decisions. "Then we remind people that some battles are too important to lose." Back in her cell, Riley lay on a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant and despair, staring at fluorescent lights that never quite turned off. Her military training had prepared her for capture, interrogation, even torture, but nothing had prepared her for the systematic dismantling of truth by people who'd sworn to uphold it. A guard approached her cell around dawn, keys jangling like wind chimes. "Washington, you've got visitors." She expected David Chen, or maybe her sister Carmen. Instead, she found herself face to face with 3 people she'd never seen before. An older black woman in an expensive suit, a white man with military bearing, and a young Latina with fierce eyes and a press badge. "Commander Washington," the older woman said, extending her hand through the bars. "I'm Congresswoman Dolores Mitchell. This is Colonel James Peterson, retired, and Maria Santos from the Washington Post. We're here because what happened yesterday can't happen again." Riley sat up slowly, her body aching from the narrow bunk. "Ma'am, they're gonna try to destroy you, Commander. Make you the villain in your own story, but they made one mistake." Congresswoman Mitchell's smile was sharp as a blade. "They did it on camera, and the whole world was watching." Colonel Peterson stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in uniform. "We've been fighting this battle for decades, Commander. Not in courtrooms or foxholes, but in the shadows where prejudice hides behind respectability." Today, they stepped into the light. Maria Santos held up her phone, showing social media feeds exploding with support. "The story's already gone viral. 'I stand with Riley' is trending worldwide. But that's just the beginning. We need to know. Are you ready to fight?" Riley looked at each of them in turn, seeing something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope backed by action, words supported by power, justice armed with more than good intentions. "Ma'am," she said to Congresswoman Mitchell, her voice steady as standing orders, "I've been ready my whole life." But even as she spoke, Riley knew the hardest part wasn't the fighting, it was surviving what came next. Because, in her experience, the enemy's most dangerous attacks always came after they'd been wounded. And Judge Harrison, sitting in his chambers as dawn broke over a city that would never see him the same way again, was definitely wounded. The emergency judicial review hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, barely 18 hours after the incident that had turned Judge Harrison's courtroom into a battleground. Chief Judge Patricia Blackwood, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes like flint, presided over the proceedings that would determine both Riley's immediate fate and Harrison's judicial future. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. Media vans lined the street like military vehicles, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray clouds that threatened rain. Inside, security had tripled, but the real tension crackled in the spaces between words, in the careful distance people maintained from both Riley and Harrison. Riley sat in the defendant's chair again, this time flanked by David Chen and a new addition, Elizabeth Morrison, a civil rights attorney whose reputation preceded her like thunder before lightning. Across the aisle, Judge Harrison occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. No longer on the bench, but not quite a defendant either. His attorney, Sebastian Cross, was everything Harrison used to respect: old money, Ivy League, connections that ran deeper than subway tunnels. "This is highly irregular," Chief Judge Blackwood announced, her gavel sharp as a gunshot. "We have a sitting judge accused of assault, a defendant who struck back in what she claims was self-defense, and a courtroom full of witnesses whose accounts vary wildly depending on their political affiliations." The first order of business was Riley's bail. DA Patricia Vance argued for remand without bail. The defendant is highly trained in combat techniques and has already demonstrated a willingness to use violence against judicial officers. But the video had done its work. Even Vance's argument sounded hollow when everyone had seen Harrison throw the first punch. "Bail is set at $50,000, Judge Blackwood declared. However, both parties will remain under court supervision pending the outcome of this investigation. That's when the real manipulation began. "Your Honor." Sebastian Cross rose with practiced gravitas. "My client, Judge Harrison, is willing to waive his right to judicial immunity and submit to questioning, provided it occurs in controlled circumstances that protect both parties." Elizabeth Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "What kind of controlled circumstances?" Cross smiled like a cat with cream. "A mediated session. Both parties, their attorneys, and a neutral mediator. Let them tell their stories, face to face, under oath, with cameras rolling, complete transparency." It was a trap, Riley realized immediately. Put her in a room with Harrison, let him play the wounded victim, catch her losing her temper on camera. Classic manipulation wrapped in the language of fairness. "Absolutely not," David Chen objected. "This is a criminal matter, not a civil dispute." But Chief Judge Blackwood was already nodding. "Actually, Counselor Morrison, your client has been quite vocal about transparency and truth. This would provide both." Riley caught Elizabeth's eye and saw the same calculation she was making. Refuse, and they'd look like they had something to hide. Accept, and they'd be walking into whatever game Cross was playing. "We accept," Elizabeth said finally, "with conditions. Neutral venue, independent mediator, and full video disclosure to the public afterward." "Agreed," Cross replied too quickly. 2 hours later, Riley found herself in the courthouse's seldom-used conference room, sitting across a polished table from the man who'd tried to destroy her career and her freedom. The mediator, retired Judge Angela Torres, commanded respect from all sides, 30 years on the bench, reputation for fairness, and most importantly, no connections to Harrison's network. The cameras rolled as Harrison adjusted his tie, the same expensive silk he'd worn yesterday, now somehow looking rumpled despite professional pressing. His face bore no visible marks from their encounter, but Riley could see the careful way he held his left side where her palm strike had landed. "Judge Harrison," Torres began, "you've waived your right to counsel for this session. Are you certain you want to proceed?" "Absolutely." Harrison's voice carried its old authority, but Riley caught the tremor underneath. "I have nothing to hide." Torres turned to Riley. "Commander Washington, you're represented by counsel, but you've agreed to answer questions directly. Do you understand the risks?" "Yes, ma'am." The first hour played out like a chess match between masters. Harrison painted himself as a victim of an unprovoked attack, emphasizing Riley's military training and suggesting she'd been looking for confrontation. His performance was polished, practiced, the voice that had swayed juries for 18 years. "I simply asked her to approach the bench for a routine conference," he testified, his voice heavy with wounded dignity. "The next thing I knew, she was attacking me. I feared for my life." But Riley had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. When her turn came, she spoke with the same measured precision she'd used giving mission briefings. "Judge Harrison called me girl and told me to learn my place," she said quietly. "When he raised his fist to strike me a second time, I defended myself using minimal force necessary to stop the threat." "You're lying," Harrison snapped, his composure cracking. "I never—" "Judge Harrison," Torres interrupted smoothly, "please let Commander Washington finish." That's when Elizabeth Morrison played her ace. "Your Honor, we'd like to present additional evidence." She produced a tablet showing Harrison's bailiff, Rodriguez, giving a statement to investigators. The audio was crystal clear. Judge Harrison definitely threw the first punch. Called her something that started with uppity, but I couldn't make out the rest. The commander showed remarkable restraint, honestly. If someone had hit me like that, I probably would have done more than push them away. Harrison's face went white, then red, then white again. "Rodriguez is. He's mistaken." The stress of the moment. "What about court reporter Janet Mills?" Elizabeth continued, producing another tablet. "She confirms hearing racial language and describes your behavior as unhinged and threatening." "They're lying." Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "All of them. This is a conspiracy to destroy me." The room fell silent except for the hum of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens. Riley watched Harrison's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time, revealing the frightened, angry man beneath. "Judge Harrison," Torres said quietly, "I'm going to ask you directly. Did you strike Commander Washington first?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Harrison looked around the room at the cameras, at the reporters, at Sebastian Cross, who was signaling him frantically to stop talking, but 18 years of judicial arrogance couldn't be discarded in 18 seconds. "She needed to be taught respect," he said finally, the words spilling out like blood from a wound. "These people think they can come into my courtroom, wave their medals around and intimidate me. Well, I don't intimidate easily." Riley felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Harrison had just confessed to assault on camera in front of witnesses while trying to justify it with barely concealed racism. Torres leaned forward. "Judge Harrison, are you saying you struck Commander Washington intentionally?" Harrison looked around the room again, finally understanding what he'd done. "I want to speak to my attorney." Too late. Sebastian Cross was already gathering his papers, his face ashen. Across the table, Riley sat perfectly still, her hands folded, watching a man destroy himself with his own words. "I think we have what we need," Torres announced quietly. As the cameras stopped rolling and people began filing out, Riley found herself alone with Harrison for a moment while their attorneys conferred. He looked across the table at her with something that might have been bewilderment. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you hit me harder?" "You could have. Should have." Riley studied his face, the pouched eyes, the weak chin, the desperate hunger for respect that had never been earned. She thought of all the defendants who'd stood before his bench, all the lives he'd damaged with his prejudice and pride. "Because that's not who I am," she said simply. "The uniform I wear means something, even when the people I'm sworn to protect don't deserve it." Harrison stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at his hands. "I've been a judge for 18 years. "No," Riley said, standing to leave. "You've been wearing a judge's robes for 18 years. There's a difference." As she walked toward the door, Harrison called after her, "This isn't over, you know. I have friends, connections, people who owe me favors." Riley paused in the doorway without turning around. "So do I, Judge Harrison. The difference is, mine are people who earned their positions instead of inheriting them." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Harrison alone with his shattered authority and the growing realization that he'd just declared war on someone who'd actually fought in them. The storm was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The call came at 3:17 a.m., jarring Riley from the first real sleep she'd managed in 48 hours. Her sister Carmen's voice crackled through the phone, tight with fear and fury. "Riley, you need to see the news. Channel 7. Now." Riley fumbled for the remote in her downtown hotel room, paid for by a veterans advocacy group, after her apartment had been swarmed by reporters. The television flickered to life, showing her own face in military dress blues alongside a headline that made her blood run cold: "Decorated hero or dangerous veteran. The Riley Washington you don't know." The reporter, a perfectly coiffed woman named Sandra Chen, spoke with a grave authority reserved for scandals. "Tonight, Channel 7 has obtained exclusive information about Commander Riley Washington's military record, including sealed disciplinary files that paint a troubling picture of a soldier struggling with anger and authority issues." What followed was a masterclass in character assassination. Carefully edited footage showed Riley during a heated congressional hearing about military sexual assault, her passionate testimony about systemic failures, twisted to make her appear unhinged. A former commanding officer, Colonel Bradley Hammonds, appeared via satellite to discuss her concerning behavioral patterns. "Commander Washington was an effective operator," Hammonds said, his voice heavy with manufactured concern, "but she had difficulty with authority figures. There were incidents that required intervention." Riley's hands shook as she watched her life's work reduced to sound bites and speculation. The sealed disciplinary files were revealed to be a single letter of counseling from 2019 standard paperwork after she'd filed a complaint about sexual harassment that her command had preferred to ignore. But the real gut punch came at the end of the segment. "We've also learned that Commander Washington's father, Vernon Washington, died in police custody in 1987 after what officers described as a violent altercation. Some experts suggest this tragic family history may have contributed to her apparent hostility toward authority figures." The remote cracked in Riley's grip. They'd found her deepest wound and torn it open for the world to see. By dawn, Elizabeth Morrison was at Riley's hotel door with coffee, legal briefs, and barely controlled rage. "Harrison's people work fast," she said without preamble. "This hit job had to be prepared in advance. They were ready to destroy you the moment you fought back." "How did they get my father's file?" Riley asked, her voice hollow as cave echoes. "Money, connections, favors called in. The usual." Elizabeth set down her briefcase and studied Riley's face. "Want to tell me what really happened to Vernon Washington?" Riley walked to the window, looking down at the street, where protesters had begun gathering, some supporting her, others calling for her arrest. The morning light caught the scars on her knuckles, reminders of fights she'd won and battles she'd lost. "I was 8, she began quietly. Dad was coming home from his job at the shipyard, double shift because Mom was pregnant with Carmen. 3 cops pulled him over 6 blocks from our house." The memories came flooding back with photographic clarity. Her father's lunch pail scattered across the pavement, his work shirt torn, the way his wedding ring caught the streetlight as the handcuffs clicked shut. The official report said he resisted arrest, became violent, suffered a heart attack in custody. But Mrs. Henderson from across the street saw the whole thing. She said Dad never raised a hand, never even raised his voice, just kept asking what he'd done wrong. Elizabeth nodded grimly. "Let me guess. No witnesses came forward officially." This was 1987 in Alabama. Black man dies in police custody. White officers involved, no video, no audio. Case closed. Riley's reflection stared back from the window, 8 years old again and watching her world collapse. Mom never recovered. Started drinking, lost the baby, died of liver failure when I was 16. "Is that why you joined the military?" Riley turned from the window, her expression hardening like steel in a forge. "I joined because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself, but I stayed because I learned that sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to get inside it and break it back." Across town, Judge Harrison paced his study while Sebastian Cross laid out newspaper clippings like tarot cards, predicting doom. The character assassination piece had been Cross's idea, calling in favors from media contacts and private investigators. But instead of destroying Riley's credibility, it seemed to be generating sympathy. "Look at these numbers," Cross said, pointing to his tablet. "Her approval rating has gone up 15 points overnight. Twitter hashtags are trending worldwide. Veterans groups are organizing rallies in 12 cities. Harrison's reflection in the window showed a man aging years in days. I don't understand. We gave them everything. Disciplinary files, family history, expert testimony about PTSD and violence. We gave them a story about a little girl who watched her father die and grew up to serve her country anyway." Cross replied dryly, "Congratulations, Harold. We just made her a martyr." The irony wasn't lost on Harrison that his own family story would sound far less sympathetic. Harrison Industries had made its fortune in the 1950s, supplying materials to military contractors, materials that investigations later revealed were substandard, leading to equipment failures that cost American lives in Korea. The investigations had been quietly buried, the contracts renewed, the profits invested in real estate and political campaigns. His appointment to the bench hadn't come through merit, but through connections. His grandfather had purchased with blood money and his father had maintained through carefully orchestrated favors. Harold Harrison III was the 3rd generation of a dynasty built on other people's suffering. "There's something else," Cross said quietly. "The FBI opened an investigation this morning. Civil rights violation, assault under color of authority. They're sending a team from Washington." Harrison's coffee cup shattered against the hardwood floor. "You said this would go away. That was before you confessed on camera to assaulting her intentionally." Cross gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man abandoning a sinking ship. "Harold, I'm going to give you some advice as both your attorney and your friend. Resign from the bench, issue a public apology, and pray she doesn't file a civil suit." "Resign?" The word came out strangled. "I've been a judge for 18 years. And in 18 years, you've developed a reputation for bias that's about to be examined under a microscope. Do you really want investigators digging through every case you've ever decided? Every sentence you've handed down? Every defendant who might have been treated differently because of their race?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Harrison knew his record wouldn't survive scrutiny. Too many harsh sentences for minorities, too many lenient deals for white defendants, too many patterns that looked like coincidence until viewed together. Meanwhile, Riley sat in Elizabeth Morrison's law office, surrounded by legal documents and photographs that told the story of her father's death in excruciating detail. Police reports, witness statements, coroner's findings, all pointing to a cover-up that had lasted 35 years. "We can use this," Elizabeth said gently. "Show the jury why you reacted the way you did. Demonstrate a pattern of institutional bias." "I don't want to use my father's death as a legal strategy," Riley replied firmly. "He deserves better than that." "Then, what do you want?" Riley looked at the photographs spread across the conference table, her father's work clothes, his lunch pail, the wedding ring that had been returned to her mother in a manila envelope with no explanation. Then she looked at her own reflection in the office window, seeing not just herself, but generations of people who'd been told to know their place, to stay quiet, to accept injustice as the price of peace. "I want the truth," she said finally. "All of it. Not just about what happened in that courtroom, but about the system that created Judge Harrison. The connections, the favors, the money that bought his appointment. I want people to understand that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of corruption that's been festering for decades." Elizabeth smiled grimly. "That's not a legal case, Riley. That's a war." Riley stood, straightening her shoulders with the same precision she'd used adjusting her uniform every morning for 22 years. "Good thing I know how to fight wars." But even as she spoke, Riley knew this wouldn't be one with superior firepower or tactical brilliance. This would be won or lost in the court of public opinion, where truth was often less powerful than perception, and justice wore whatever face the highest bidder painted on her. The real battle was just beginning. And somewhere across town, Judge Harrison was learning that some enemies couldn't be intimidated into submission. They could only be defeated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Janet Mills, Judge Harrison's court reporter for the past 8 years. She appeared at Elizabeth Morrison's office on a rainy Thursday morning, clutching a worn leather portfolio and wearing the haunted expression of someone who'd carried secrets too long. "I can't do this anymore," she said, settling into the chair across from Riley and Elizabeth. "I've watched him destroy too many lives. What he did to you, it wasn't the first time." Riley leaned forward, her voice gentle. "What do you mean, Mrs. Mills?" Janet opened her portfolio with trembling fingers, revealing transcripts, notes, and recordings that painted a devastating picture of Harrison's 18-year reign. "He keeps recordings of all his cases, says it's for appeals, but really it's for leverage. I've been transcribing them for years, listening to him berate defendants, make racist comments, threaten attorneys who crossed him." Elizabeth's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. "Janet, do you understand what you're showing us?" "I understand I should have come forward years ago." Tears rolled down Janet's cheeks. "But I was scared. He threatened to ruin my career, said I'd never work in any courthouse again. I have grandchildren to support, medical bills." Riley reached across the table and covered Janet's hand with her own. "You're here now, that's what matters." The gesture broke something loose in Janet, and the whole story poured out. Harrison's pattern of targeting minority defendants with excessive sentences, his practice of dismissing cases for white defendants with connections, the time he'd called a black teenager a future criminal during sentencing, the way he'd laugh with his cronies about keeping certain elements in line. "The worst was the Rodriguez case," Janet whispered. "Maria Rodriguez, 19 years old, college student, minor drug possession charge that should have been probation. But she talked back to him in court, defended herself when he made a comment about anchor babies. He gave her 3 years in state prison." Riley felt something cold settle in her chest. What happened to her? She died in prison. Suicide. Left a note saying she couldn't live with the shame of disappointing her family. Janet's voice broke completely. "I transcribed that suicide note for the appeals file." Harrison read it and said, "One less problem to worry about." The room fell silent except for the rain against the windows, and Janet's quiet sobs. Riley stared at the transcripts, seeing not just words on paper but lives destroyed by one man's unchecked prejudice and power. "Why are you telling us this now?" Elizabeth asked gently. Janet looked up, her eyes red but determined. Because when I saw that video of him hitting you, I saw Maria Rodriguez. I saw every defendant he's humiliated and destroyed. And I realized that if I stayed quiet, I was part of it. Over the next 3 hours, Janet revealed the full scope of Harrison's corruption. Secret meetings with prosecutors to coordinate harsh sentences, favorable rulings for defendants whose families made donations to his Judicial Excellence Fund, a pattern of bias so systematic it amounted to a parallel legal system based on race and class. But the most damaging revelation came last. Harrison's own words, recorded during a private conversation with DA Patricia Vance. "I don't care if she's a war hero." Harrison's voice crackled from Janet's hidden recording device. "These people need to be reminded of their place. The military's made them forget that decorations don't change what they are. I've been putting uppity minorities in their place for 18 years, and I'm not stopping now." Riley closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every defendant who'd stood before Harrison's bench, every family destroyed by his prejudice, every dream crushed under his gavel. When she opened them, she found Janet watching her with something that looked like hope. "What you did in that courtroom," Janet said quietly. "It gave me courage, watching you stand up to him, seeing him for what he really is. It made me remember that silence isn't neutrality. It's complicity." That evening, Riley found herself in an unexpected place, the Moonlight Diner on 5th Street, sharing coffee and pie with Janet Mills and a growing circle of people whose lives had intersected with Harrison's courtroom. Word had spread through social media and community networks. Victims, families, attorneys, courthouse employees who'd witnessed Harrison's behavior but felt powerless to stop it. Maria Santos, the young reporter who'd first interviewed Riley, sat across from Mrs. Catherine Rodriguez, Maria's mother, whose daughter had died in prison 3 years ago. Next to her sat David Winters, a white attorney who'd been held in contempt for objecting to Harrison's racial comments. At the end of the table, Officer Luis Martinez, the elderly veteran Harrison had pushed to the ground during the protest, shared stories with Janet's grandson, a college student studying criminal justice. "I always wondered if there were others," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice heavy with grief, but strengthened by solidarity. "The public defender told me judges were just like that there was nothing we could do." "There was nothing you could do," Riley corrected gently. "One person against a system? That's not a fair fight. But this many people? This many voices? That changes everything." David Winters pulled out his phone, showing social media feeds exploding with Justice for Maria hashtags, alongside "I stand with Riley." "Look at this. Attorneys from 6 states are coming forward with Harrison stories. Law students are organizing protests at 12 universities. The American Bar Association just announced they're opening an ethics investigation." Officer Martinez nodded slowly. "My daughter, she's a lawyer in California, says they're teaching this case in law schools already, calling it a watershed moment for judicial accountability." But it was Janet's grandson, Tommy, who captured the moment's significance. "My grandmother spent 8 years watching bad things happen and feeling like she couldn't stop them. But when she saw you stand up to that judge, she realized she could stand up too. Now look at all of us." Riley looked around the table at faces that had found each other through shared trauma, but were bonding through shared purpose. Mrs. Rodriguez sharing childhood photos of Maria, David recounting cases where he'd wished he'd done more, Officer Martinez teaching Tommy about the difference between following orders and following conscience. "You know what the strangest part is?" Riley said, stirring sugar into her coffee. 3 days ago, I thought I was alone in that courtroom. Now I realize I was never alone. All of you were there with me. Every person he'd hurt, every injustice he'd committed, every time someone should have spoken up but couldn't." Janet reached across the table and squeezed Riley's hand. "And now we're all speaking up together." The conversation stretched past midnight, fueled by coffee, shared pain, and something none of them had expected to find: hope. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans to coordinate testimony, organized support groups for other victims who might come forward. As the diner began to empty, Mrs. Rodriguez approached Riley with a small wooden cross on a chain. "This was Maria's," she said quietly. "She wore it every day, said it reminded her that even in dark places, there's light." Riley accepted the cross with reverence, feeling its weight, not just the wood and silver, but the love and loss it represented. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't." "You can. You will. Because you're going to make sure what happened to my Maria never happens to another child." The older woman's eyes blazed with fierce maternal love. "You're going to be the light she couldn't find." Walking back to her hotel through empty streets, Riley fingered the cross in her pocket and thought about the strange alchemy that transformed individual pain into collective power. Harrison had tried to isolate her, to make her seem dangerous and unstable. Instead, he'd created a focal point for everyone he'd ever wronged. Back in his mansion, Judge Harrison sat in his study, scrolling through social media feeds that grew more damaging by the hour. Stories were emerging from across his career: defendants, attorneys, courthouse employees, all sharing experiences that painted a devastating picture of systematic bias and abuse of power. His phone buzzed with a text from Sebastian Cross. "Resignation papers are ready. Sign them tomorrow, or I'm withdrawing as your attorney." Harrison set down his phone and looked at his reflection in the dark window. For 18 years he'd wielded his gavel like a weapon, using his position to reinforce the social order he'd been raised to believe in. Now that order was crumbling, and he was discovering that a lifetime of making enemies had left him with precious few friends. The irony wasn't lost on him that Riley Washington, the woman he'd tried to destroy, had somehow brought together a coalition of his victims more powerful than any he'd faced in his career. By trying to put her in her place, he'd helped her find her voice. And that voice was becoming a chorus that would soon be impossible to ignore. Have you ever witnessed injustice and struggled with whether to speak up? Share your thoughts on how everyday people can find the courage to stand against powerful systems, and what gives you hope when facing seemingly impossible odds. The ambush came at dawn on Friday morning, orchestrated with military precision by people who understood that sometimes you had to destroy the village to save it. Riley woke to her phone buzzing incessantly. Elizabeth Morrison's number flashing urgently across the screen. "Riley, don't leave your hotel room. Don't talk to anyone. Don't even look out the window." "What's happening?" "They've escalated. Turn on channel 6. The television revealed Riley's worst nightmare made real. Sandra Chen stood outside the courthouse, her expression grave as she delivered what sounded like a death sentence. This morning, Channel 7 has obtained exclusive video footage that appears to show Commander Riley Washington in what experts are calling a violent rage episode during a classified military operation in Afghanistan. The footage was grainy, clearly edited, but devastating in its implications. It showed Riley in combat gear, apparently striking a restrained prisoner during an interrogation. Her voice, distorted but recognizable, seemed to be shouting threats and racial slurs. Military sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirm this footage depicts Commander Washington during a 2018 operation that resulted in multiple civilian casualties and a formal reprimand for excessive force. Riley's hands shook as she watched 22 years of honorable service reduced to carefully edited lies. The footage was sophisticated, professional-grade deepfake technology that would fool casual viewers and provide just enough doubt to poison jury pools. Her phone exploded with calls. David Chen, frantic. "Riley, we need to get ahead of this. The prosecution is moving to have your bail revoked." Carmen, crying. "Riley, they're saying you're a war criminal. The neighbors are asking if it's true." Congresswoman Mitchell, furious. "This is character assassination at the highest level. We're tracking the source, but the damage is already spreading." But the call that broke her heart came from Tommy Mills, Janet's grandson. "Commander Washington, my grandmother is scared. She's talking about withdrawing her testimony. Says she might have been wrong about what she saw." Riley sank onto the hotel bed, Maria Rodriguez's cross burning like a brand in her palm. 3 days ago, she'd found a community of survivors ready to seek justice together. Now she watched that coalition crumble under the weight of manufactured scandal and carefully orchestrated doubt. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. They couldn't attack the video of Harrison striking her too many witnesses, too clear. So instead, they attacked her character, making her seem like the kind of person who deserved what happened. Elizabeth arrived within the hour, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from rushing through media gauntlets. "It's sophisticated work," she said, examining the footage on her laptop. "Whoever did this has serious resources and technical expertise." "Is it real?" Riley asked quietly. Elizabeth looked up sharply. "What?" "The video. I've done things in combat, things I'm not proud of. Interrogations got heated sometimes. What if—" "Stop!" Elizabeth's voice cut like a blade. "Don't you dare let them get in your head. I've seen your complete military record, the real one, not the edited highlights they're peddling. You were investigated exactly once in 22 years for filing a sexual harassment complaint that your command didn't want to handle. That's it. But doubt, once planted, grew like poison ivy." Riley found herself questioning memories, wondering if trauma had erased moments of moral compromise, if the woman she thought she was existed only in her own mind. The real devastation came at 2 p.m. when Janet Mills called to withdraw her testimony. "I'm sorry," Janet sobbed over the phone, "but they showed me the video. Said you might be dangerous, that supporting you could make me an accessory to covering up war crimes. My grandson, he has scholarships, college plans. I can't risk his future." One by one, the coalition began to fracture. David Winters received a visit from the State Bar Association about potential ethical violations in his past cases. Officer Martinez was informed that his veterans' benefits were under review for irregularities. Mrs. Rodriguez got a call suggesting that speaking out might jeopardize her immigration status. The message was clear: support Riley Washington and face consequences. By evening, the Moonlight Diner sat nearly empty. Only Maria Santos remained, her press credentials providing some protection from the intimidation campaign. She sat across from Riley, both women nursing cold coffee and watching their movement dissolve in real time. "They're good," Maria admitted grimly. "Systematic, thorough, and completely ruthless. This isn't just about discrediting you, it's about making sure nobody ever tries to challenge the system again." Riley stared at her reflection in the diner's window, seeing not a decorated war hero but a woman who'd overreached, who'd dared to fight back against forces larger than herself. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just take the plea deal, serve my time quietly, and let this end. Is that what Maria Rodriguez would want? The name hit like a physical blow. Riley looked down at the cross in her palm, thinking of the 19-year-old girl who died in prison rather than accept an unjust system. "Maria Rodriguez is dead because nobody fought for her when it mattered," Riley said quietly. "Just like my father died because nobody stood up when 3 cops decided his life didn't matter. And now they're counting on me to do the same thing, to break, to give up, to let them bury this story along with all the others." Riley's voice hardened like steel in a forge. "But I'm not 19 years old and scared. I'm not a court reporter afraid of losing her job. I'm a United States Navy SEAL, and I don't surrender to enemy forces." But even as she spoke the words, Riley felt the weight of isolation settling around her like armor made of lead, fighting alone against a system designed to crush individual resistance. It wasn't courage, it was suicide. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Harrison celebrated his Pyrrhic victory with expensive whiskey and the hollow satisfaction of survival. "It's working," Sebastian Cross reported, scrolling through social media analytics. Her approval rating has dropped 30 points in 12 hours. The veterans groups are distancing themselves. Even her own legal team is advising a plea bargain. Harrison poured another drink, trying to wash away the taste of his own methods. "What about the federal investigation?" "Stalled. Hard to investigate civil rights violations when the victim looks like a war criminal." But Cross's expression remained troubled. "Harold, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. The resources we used for this operation, the video editing, the investigation into her military record, the coordination with media outlets, who's paying for it?" Harrison's hand tightened around his glass. "Does it matter? It matters if we're dealing with people who expect favors in return. The kind of favors that make federal judges disappear when they become inconvenient." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Harrison had made a deal with devils to save his career, but devils never settled for even exchanges. They always collected interest. Back in her hotel room, Riley sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her dress blue uniform hanging in the closet. 22 years of service reduced to a prop in someone else's political theater. Outside, protesters chanted, but now they were calling for her arrest, not her vindication. Her phone buzzed with a final text from Congresswoman Mitchell. "I'm sorry, Riley. The party can't afford to be associated with this anymore. You're on your own." On her own. The words echoed in the empty room, bouncing off walls that suddenly felt like a prison cell. Riley Washington, who'd survived Taliban ambushes and terrorist bombings, who'd carried wounded soldiers through minefields and defused bombs with her bare hands, had finally found an enemy she couldn't defeat. The truth, when it was buried under enough lies to make people forget what they'd seen with their own eyes. Tomorrow would bring the plea hearing, where she'd be expected to confess to crimes she didn't commit to avoid punishment for defending herself against a man who'd tried to destroy her. But tonight, she sat alone in a hotel room, holding a dead girl's cross, and wondering if Maria Rodriguez had felt this same crushing weight of isolation, before she decided she couldn't carry it anymore. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in her military career, Commander Riley Washington wasn't sure she could win it. "I've carefully read through your powerful story. What an incredible journey you've built through Acts 1 to 1. The character development, the systematic buildup of Harrison's corruption, the heartbreaking coalition that formed and then shattered, it's masterfully crafted emotional storytelling. I can see exactly where we are." Riley, at her absolute lowest point, completely isolated after the character assassination campaign, facing the choice between a humiliating plea deal or fighting alone against impossible odds. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the emotional weight of Maria Rodriguez's cross and her father's memory are perfectly positioned for the final acts. The plea hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. And at 3:17 a.m., Riley Washington sat in the darkness of her hotel room, staring at the legal documents that would end everything she'd fought for. The papers glowed pale in the lamplight: a confession to assault, agreement to anger management classes, resignation from the Navy with loss of pension and benefits. All she had to do was sign her name, and the nightmare would be over. Her phone had been silent for hours. No more calls from supporters. No more messages of encouragement, no more promises that justice would prevail. Just the hollow quiet of abandonment and the weight of Maria Rodriguez's cross in her palm. "Maybe they're right," she thought, echoing the doubt that had been planted by Harrison's sophisticated campaign. "Maybe I am everything they say I am. Maybe I've been lying to myself about who I really am." The edited video played on loop in her mind. Her face, her voice, saying and doing things that felt alien yet familiar enough to create doubt. 22 years of service, and all it took was 60 seconds of manufactured footage to make her question every decision she'd ever made in uniform. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the social media feeds that had once supported her. The hashtags had changed. Riley Washington lied. Fake hero. Justice for Harrison. Comments that made her skin crawl. People she'd never met, calling her a fraud, a terrorist, a disgrace to the uniform. But then, buried deep in the feed, she found something that stopped her cold. A video posted at 2:47 a.m. by a user called A Truth Seeker 2024, grainy cell phone footage taken from the courtroom gallery during her confrontation with Harrison. But this wasn't the official footage everyone had seen. This was raw, unedited, taken from an angle that showed everything. Harrison's face twisted with rage, calling her uppity and worse, his fist connecting with her cheek, her measured response controlled, professional, using exactly the force necessary to stop a continued threat. And most importantly, the aftermath. Harrison on his knees, unharmed, while Riley stepped back with her hands visible, de-escalating instead of pressing her advantage. The video had 37 views. Riley sat up straighter, something stirring in her chest like embers finding oxygen. She clicked on the user profile, anonymous, created 3 days ago, no other posts. Someone had risked everything to upload this footage, knowing they'd face the same intimidation campaign that had silenced everyone else. She wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Riley walked to the window and looked down at the empty street, seeing not abandonment but possibility. Everyone who'd supported her had been systematically targeted, threatened, and silenced. But they hadn't been converted, they'd been terrorized into submission. There was a difference. Her father's voice echoed from decades past. Riley, baby, sometimes doing right means standing alone. But standing alone don't mean being wrong. Vernon Washington had stood alone against 3 police officers on a dark Alabama street in 19. He'd never raised his hand, never fought back, never given them cause to brutalize him, and he died anyway, because sometimes the system was so corrupt that even perfect compliance couldn't save you. But Riley wasn't her father. She'd been trained to fight back, taught to never leave a fallen comrade, conditioned to complete the mission no matter the cost. And her mission had never been about avoiding punishment, it had been about justice for Maria Rodriguez, for her father, for everyone who'd been crushed under Harrison's gavel over 18 years. She picked up the unsigned plea agreement and held it over the hotel room's shredder. The papers hung there for a long moment, representing safety, survival, the path of least resistance. All she had to do was accept that the system was too powerful to fight, that truth was less important than convenience, that one person couldn't make a difference against institutional corruption. The papers fell into the shredder with a sound like thunder. Riley walked to her closet and pulled out her dress blue uniform, running her fingers over ribbons that represented not just personal achievement, but a promise to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She'd taken that oath as an 18-year-old kid from Alabama who'd never imagined she'd have to keep it in an American courtroom. But promises made in dress blues weren't negotiable. Not to commanding officers, not to corrupt judges, not to systems that preferred comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. She began getting dressed with the same precision she'd used preparing for combat missions, each button, each crease, each ribbon positioned exactly. If she was going to stand alone in that courtroom, she'd do it in uniform, representing not just herself, but every service member who'd been told to know their place. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who'd made her choice. The fear was still there. She wasn't suicidal, just determined. The odds were still impossible. One person against a system designed to crush individual resistance. But some fights were worth having even when you couldn't win them. Especially when you couldn't win them. At 6 a.m., Riley's phone buzzed with a call from Elizabeth Morrison. She almost didn't answer. Elizabeth had been professional, but distant since the character assassination began, clearly preparing for the inevitable plea negotiation. Riley? Please tell me you're not about to do something stupid. Define stupid. Refusing the plea deal. Fighting this in court. Believing you can win against people who've already proven they'll destroy anyone who opposes them. Riley sat on the hotel bed, fully dressed in her service uniform, watching the sunrise paint gold across the city that was preparing to judge her. Elizabeth, can I ask you something? Why did you become a civil rights attorney? A long pause. What does that have to do with anything? Just curious. With your credentials, you could make 10 times as much in corporate law. Why choose this? Because, Elizabeth's voice softened slightly. Because I believed that individual courage could challenge systemic injustice, that one person standing up could inspire others to do the same. And do you still believe that? Another pause, longer this time. Riley, belief doesn't stop bullets. Courage doesn't overcome superior firepower. Sometimes tactical retreat is the only option. You're right, Riley said quietly. But sometimes retreat means abandoning everyone who can't retreat with you. Maria Rodriguez couldn't retreat. My father couldn't retreat. If I take this plea deal, I'm not just surrendering. I'm confirming that the system works, that people like Harrison can do whatever they want as long as they're willing to pay the price in lies and intimidation. And if you fight and lose, if they destroy you completely? Riley stood up, looking at herself in the mirror one final time. The woman staring back wore the uniform of the United States Navy, bore the scars of service to her country, and carried the hopes of everyone who'd ever been told their place was on their knees. Then at least Maria Rodriguez will know that someone tried. At 8:30 a.m., Riley Washington walked out of her hotel and toward the courthouse, alone but not defeated. Behind her, the unsigned plea agreement lay in pieces in the shredder. Ahead of her waited Judge Harrison's final gambit and a legal system that had never been designed for people like her. But systems could be changed. History had proven that much, and sometimes change started with one person refusing to accept what everyone else said was inevitable. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. When facing impossible odds, how do you find the courage to keep fighting? Share your thoughts on what it means to stand up for principle, even when you're standing alone. The courthouse steps at 8:45 a.m. should have been empty, except for Riley Washington, walking alone toward what everyone expected to be her surrender. Instead, she found herself facing something that made her heart skip, a crowd. Not the hostile protesters from the past few days, but the faces she'd thought she'd lost forever. Janet Mills stood at the front, clutching her grandson Tommy's hand, her shoulders squared with newfound determination. Behind her, and at the center of it all, Officer Martinez, the elderly veteran Harrison, had stood in his dress uniform, ribbons gleaming in the morning sun. "Commander," he said, snapping to attention with military precision. "Permission to accompany you to battle, ma'am." Riley's throat tightened as she looked around the crowd. Maybe 40 people, not the thousands who'd supported her before, but every face representing someone who'd found their courage again. "I thought, the video, the threats." "We saw the real footage," Tommy Mills said, holding up his phone. "Someone posted it at 3 a.m. It's been shared 10,000 times since then." His grin was fierce as his grandmother's grip on his hand. "Turns out the truth is harder to bury than they thought." Janet stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I've been scared for so long, Riley. Scared of losing my job, scared of making trouble, scared of standing up to people in power. But watching you walk toward that courthouse alone, it reminded me that some things are worth being scared for." As they climbed the courthouse steps together, Riley felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The fear was still there, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger, purpose backed by community, truth supported by courage. Inside Courtroom 4B, Judge Patricia Blackwood called for order as Riley entered with her unlikely entourage. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, reporters, veterans, civil rights activists, and citizens who'd been following the story. But more importantly, sitting in the front row was a man Riley didn't recognize, FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb, his presence alone speaking volumes about how seriously federal authorities were now taking this case. "There is no plea agreement," Riley's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. She stood at the defendant's table in full dress uniform, every ribbon and medal catching the morning light streaming through tall windows. "I'm pleading not guilty to all charges and demanding a jury trial." The courtroom erupted. Vance's face went white, then red. In the gallery, reporters scribbled frantically while cameras rolled. But Riley only had eyes for the back corner where Judge Harrison sat with Sebastian Cross, watching his carefully constructed victory crumble in real time. "What evidence?" Judge Blackwood asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected. Elizabeth produced a tablet, connecting it to the courtroom's display system. Raw, unedited footage from the incident, provided by a previously unknown witness, but more importantly, audio recordings and documentation provided by former court personnel that reveal a systematic pattern of bias, corruption, and abuse of power. The video began to play. Not the carefully edited propaganda that had dominated news cycles, but Tommy Mills's raw footage from the gallery. Every detail was visible: Harrison's rage, his racist language, his unprovoked assault, and Riley's measured response. But this time, the audio was crystal clear. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." Harrison's voice filled the courtroom, every word a nail in his professional coffin. "Learn your place, you uppity." Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked like thunder. "That's enough." But Elizabeth wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we also have testimony from 8 former defendants who were subjected to similar treatment, documented evidence of favorable sentencing for connected defendants, and recorded conversations proving coordination between Judge Harrison and the District Attorney's Office to ensure harsh sentences for minority defendants." In the gallery, Janet Mills stood up slowly, her voice clear as mountain water. "Your Honor, I have 18 years of transcripts, recordings, and documentation of Judge Harrison's conduct. I'm prepared to testify to everything I've witnessed." One by one, others stood. David Winters, offering testimony about judicial bias. Mrs. Rodriguez, speaking for her dead daughter. Officer Martinez, describing the assault that had started Riley's case. Citizens, attorneys, courthouse employees. Everyone Harrison had intimidated into silence, now finding their voices together. Harrison himself sat frozen, watching his world disintegrate with each new revelation. The man who'd wielded absolute power for 18 years was learning what powerlessness felt like, and the lesson was devastating. But the moment that shattered everything came when Tommy Mills approached the witness stand, no longer the scared college student, but a young man who'd found his courage. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite his youth, "I was the anonymous poster. Truth Seeker 2024. I recorded that video during the original incident, but I was too scared to come forward. Scared of retaliation, scared of getting my grandmother in trouble, scared of challenging the system." He looked directly at Riley, his eyes bright with determination. "But Commander Washington taught me something. She showed me that sometimes being scared isn't an excuse for staying silent. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up when it matters most, even if you're standing alone." "What made you finally post the video?" Elizabeth asked gently. Tommy's smile was fierce as his grandmother's pride. "I realized I wasn't standing alone. None of us were. We were all connected by the truth, and the truth was strong enough to fight back." The rest moved with swift inevitability. Harrison's resignation, effective immediately. Federal charges for civil rights violations and conspiracy. D.A. Vance's announcement that all of Harrison's cases would be reviewed for bias. The American Bar Association's emergency ethics investigation. But for Riley, the most important moment came after the formal proceedings ended, when she found herself surrounded by the coalition that had reformed, stronger than before. Janet Mills embraced her with tears of relief. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed Maria's cross back into her hands, not as a burden this time, but as a reminder that some fights echo through generations. "What happens now?" Tommy asked as they stood on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing around them like celebration fireworks. Riley looked out at the crowd, reporters demanding statements. Supporters cheering, citizens who'd never heard of her a week ago, but now understood that individual courage could challenge institutional power. "Now we make sure this never happens again. We reform the system, we hold judges accountable, we create oversight that has teeth." She held up Maria's cross, its silver surface catching the afternoon sun. "And we remember that every person who stands in a courtroom deserves the same justice, regardless of their color, their background, or their ability to fight back." Officer Martinez stepped forward, his weathered face bright with respect. Permission to make a suggestion, Commander? Granted. Run for office. We need people like you making the laws, not just following them. The idea hit Riley like lightning, not unwelcome, but transformative. Judge Patricia Blackwood approached from behind, her stern expression softened by something that looked like hope. Commander Washington, I've been on the bench for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here today. One person's courage inspiring an entire community to find theirs. She extended her hand in respect. Thank you for reminding us what justice actually looks like. As the crowd began to disperse, Riley found herself alone for a moment with Elizabeth Morrison, who was packing up legal documents that would never be needed. I owe you an apology, Elizabeth said quietly. I let fear override principles. I forgot why I became a lawyer in the first place. We all get scared, Riley replied, fingering Maria's cross. The question isn't whether we're afraid, it's what we do with the fear. Elizabeth smiled. The first genuine smile Riley had seen from her in days. So what are you going to do now? You've got a story to tell, a platform most people never get, a chance to really change things. Riley looked back at the courthouse where she'd been assaulted, arrested, and nearly destroyed, but also where she'd downed her true calling. I'm going to keep fighting. For Maria Rodriguez, for my father, for everyone who needs someone to stand up when it matters most. She squared her shoulders with military precision, the same gesture she'd used every morning for 22 years when putting on her uniform. But now it meant something different, not just service to country, but service to justice itself. Besides, she added with a grin that would have made her father proud, I'm just getting started. The war was over. Justice had won, and somewhere in the distance, Riley could swear she heard the sound of her father's voice carried on Alabama wind. That's my girl. That's my fighting girl. What does true courage look like to you? How can we build communities that support individuals brave enough to stand up for justice? Share your thoughts on how we can all be part of the change we want to see in the world.
If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.